Okay, welcome to day 2 of coronavirus psychology. And before we start, why don't you quick pause the video and do a little review of acculturation. See if you can write down one researcher, the aim, and what the findings would be in relation to acculturation. Little IB exam review, ready, go. So the reason we show this clip is to emphasize the fact that there can be stereotypes and assumptions made within in-groups. So stereotypes aren't specific just to in-groups and out-groups. So obviously this is a quote that you would be shocked to find out that Reverend Jesse Jackson said. Obviously a major player in the black community. Even recently, Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary was trying to find a way to reach the African American community and get them to come out and support Bernie Sanders. And he reached out to Jesse Jackson to try to get him to support him, which he did. And so somebody who has, even like Jesse Jackson, who's a prominent member of the black community in the in group, still has negative assumptions and stereotypes that he's making within his in group. So like Ms. Curry mentioned yesterday, this key concept is broken up into two parts, and so I think we are now pretty much speaks for itself, and we can address stereotypes. And these are both terms that you should be familiar with, right? Schemas really are the ideas or the this evidence that we've stored in our brain based on our past experiences, and that is really a foundational part of how we make stereotypes. Things we've seen before, interactions we've had fluid in with are and people, those sit in our brains identify with and help our brains make shortcuts and really remembering that members of that particular in groups and your out groups. Sticking on the theme of groups, we just learned about social identity, but your group, your in group, and your out group, we talked about social comparison. You are trying to rise your in group up, and oftentimes that is at the expense of an out group. And so you are looking for things in your schema to try to make your group look good and the other out group look bad. And that's those two concepts, which should be in your intros, are kind of the foundation for stereotypes. Okay, for the next 2 slides, you are going to watch 2 different videos, very different perspectives on really the exact same event. And we've talked about gatekeepers before, and really this is an example of the media being a gatekeeper and how it portrays literally the exact same event in wildly different ways. So I'm going to let you pause the video now, and then we'll talk about it briefly here after you've done that. Okay, now that you've watched those videos, if you're looking for specific examples, right, both of these are young boys who have basically stolen a car and drove it around and put other people in danger. In the first video, you bring in the whole family, they get to go on a talk show, it's very formal. The dad, I believe, mentions him as just an all-American boy, and it just seems like, ha ha ha, that's what happens, and everybody's safe, and so we're all good. In the second video, the exact same thing happens, but it's portrayed very differently. They show a lot of the damage that the car's done, and these 2 exact events are portrayed differently by the gatekeepers, and when people view these, they think very differently about the same event done by 2 different kids. Yesterday, we talked about 2 components of stereotypes forming, being implicit and explicit, and really the gatekeepers and the media focus on the implicit aspect. You're not deliberately saying vicious things about people, it's just the way that you're presenting information is steering people to think one way or another about a certain issue or a certain type of person. And in the yellow there's that example of how the media frames stories, and I'll just use the example of mass shooters. Oftentimes, if the mass shooter is somebody not from the United States, there's a focus on limiting immigration, and the person is referred to as, a terrorist. If the mass shooter is white, the frame by the media is oftentimes about mental health, and this person wasn't mentally stable, and we need to put more money into mental health resources. And so really, again, that's an example of the gatekeepers of the media portraying really the same event in two different lights. And we are subconsciously then making shortcuts in our brains, and these are filling our schemas about how we should think about these different groups of people. So if you look at this graph, this is a good representation of an illusory correlation that you could make. So if you look at it, it's pretty clear that as people eat more ice cream, more people drown. And if I didn't know any better, and if I didn't think about the underlying causes, I could say, wow, we really have to stop people from eating ice cream. We got to get in touch with the people at Ben & Jerry's so we can limit the drowning deaths. Hey, but if you think about it, obviously the reason that these are aligning together is because it's warmer in the summer, and that's when people eat ice cream. It's also warmer in the summertime, and that's when people are much more likely to swim. So really, it's not that one causes the other, but if you looked at that graph and you said, oh, well, drowning is related to ice creams, we would be making a connection between things that don't exist. And that is really what happens when we make stereotypes and overgeneralizations. So here is how we are going to specifically answer the first part of the question, how are stereotypes formed? It is the concept of illusory correlations, which means that your mind is going to make connections between things that don't necessarily exist. If you look at the two words, illusory, okay, it's an illusion. It's not actually there, and you're making a correlation or a tie between two concepts. So illusory correlations is the concept that we're going to use on how stereotypes are formed. We are paying attention to an outlying act by a member of an outgroup, and then we are making a correlation and thinking that that act by that single member then represents every member of that outgroup. And so we are making that connection, and that's really how stereotypes are formed. And this would be the link that you would want to have, talking about how once we get to the research, which we'll talk about here in a second, this is showing in illusory correlations, people are making connections that don't exist, and that's how stereotypes are formed. So before we jump into the first researcher, let's just take a break and make sure we're all on the same page as far as what we've covered yesterday and today. So terms that we should have identified, attitudes, things that we share amongst our in-group. We talked about the media being the gatekeepers and how they portray similar events as different. We've also talked about concepts like schema and social identity theory that are the foundation for how we are going to create stereotypes. Okay? Just a kind of working definition for stereotypes, they are attitudes or beliefs about a group of people. Normally that group of people is our out-group, but as we saw with Jesse Jackson's quote, it could be our in-group as well. And those stereotypes are built up as mental representations. Most of the time we are creating illusory correlations where we're assuming that an outlying act by one member of an out-group is representative of that entire group. And so we're making a connection that doesn't exist. And oftentimes we are greatly influenced by gatekeepers and other members of our in-group. So if that all makes sense to you and you're good to go, then let's jump into the first researcher. I'll be honest, you're probably going to want to stop into one of the Zoom sessions to go over this. I'll try my best to address it without knowing exactly the questions that you have. But if you're all set on what I just went over, then let's start with the first research. I want you to read, and if you can print it off, annotate the Hamilton and Gifford reading. I believe there's a file called Ham and Giff on the top right side of my haiku page. If you can't print it off and annotate it, that's fine. At least try to read it, and just to give yourself an idea. Now that you've read it, the following slides are just examples of what they did in the actual study. So we're not going to go through them in this video, but you can see that each slide gives you the group letter, so either a member of group A or group B, and then the task or the thing that they did, so either a positive or a negative task. And this is just an example to give you, to see kind of what the procedure was like. We are not going to, you don't have to write those down. You don't have to do anything specific with them. But the next 20 slides are just examples of what they did in the actual research. Okay, so let's talk about some basics that you need to understand about Hamilton and Gifford to see how it displays illusory correlation. So the aim is to see if group size, if the majority or minority group, the size of the group impacts the perception that you have on their behavior. So you had group A that had 26 actions, and then you had group B with half that size, only 13 interactions. But they both had the same ratio of positive to negative things about each one. So they both have a 9-to-4 ratio of positive to negative actions. So that's a key. It's not like group A had way more positives and group B had way more positives. If you look at relatively speaking, they're exactly the same. The thing that you really need to focus on in the reading is the group B herding row. So there were actually in group B, there were 4 statements that were negative, but people remembered on average 6 statements that were negative. So that's a 50% increase or assumption that group B is doing significantly more negative things than they actually are. And so because you have less things to remember and less interactions with members of group B, your brain is much more likely to create an illusory correlation between members of group B and negative thoughts, negative actions. And so really this is an example of illusory correlation because there are people that we don't get to interact with very often in our out groups. And when we see a negative behavior or we hear a negative behavior about a member of an out group, our brain is much quicker to try to then make an illusory correlation between that particular one behavior, one example behavior, and extend that and generalize that to every member of the outgroup. And you can think about it in terms of minority groups throughout the United States. When people don't have an opportunity to interact with people that don't look like them or don't believe the same things they believe on a daily basis, they are much more likely to focus in and remember negative interactions that they've had because their life isn't filled with multiple opportunities to interact with those people. And so this piece of research is showing that if you don't have a lot of interactions with a group, the negative interactions stand out more, and then you make an illusory correlation between those negative actions and that entire group. And hopefully that clears it up a little bit. And again, if you need some more clarification, pop in and we can definitely go over that. So that is Hamilton and Gifford and illusory correlation of how stereotypes are formed. So with the reading and the brief explanation, you can go ahead now and complete the rest of the graphic organizer, and that is it for day 2 of coronavirus psychology. Can't stop, won't stop.